Hi, today we're going to be starting Childhood Development Assessment Task 1, Written Questions. For this task, we're under the assessment description, we're going to be having a look at the required knowledge that you need for this unit. So there are going to be questions that you need to provide answers to. This is an open book assessment, which means you can have as much documentation around you as you need to help you to answer the questions. With this particular assessment, there are some documentations that I think would be very useful for you. That is the Belonging, Being, Becoming, the Early Years Learning Framework, the Educator's Guide to the Early Years Learning Framework, which might be the first time you've used that documentation, and the Early Years National Regulations. So to start this particular assessment, as always, we go to Preview Quiz. You can see that there's 5 questions within this task. We're going to go through each of those questions just to give you some pointers. So this first one here is asking you to list the 8 pedagogical practices. So you actually need to identify which documentation you can find that in, and then you need to list those down below in this text box. Question 2 is asking you how the Early Years Learning Framework defines the practice of intentional teaching. So because this particular question is asking you to go to a form of documentation and to identify what is written within that documentation, it is okay to use the language within that booklet. However, it is important to reference when you are using that information. Question 3, this is where you might be using the Educator's Guide to Early Years Learning Framework for the first time. However, it may not be your first time. You can access that online, and it's even giving you the page numbers to go to. You'll need to read through the information to gather the answer to each of the questions, and again, popping them into the text box. Question 4 isn't actually a question answer. You do have to actually provide a report. So what it is asking you here is to really have a think about the Early Years Learning Framework. You're required to create a 1-page information sheet. So that information sheet would be an A4 piece of paper. You are particularly need to identify information about the Early Years Learning Framework for educators. So it needs to be simple, it needs to be clear, and it needs to be quite precise and specific with the information given. The areas you need to cover in this report is you need to explain the relevance of the Early Years Learning Framework. So think of that as explaining why we have the Early Years Learning Framework in early childhood education services. You also then need to explain how do we actually implement the Early Years Learning Framework. So looking at how services actually use the framework in everyday practice. And then also looking at the relationship between the Early Years Learning Framework and other legislation and regulations. So it's really important here that you note what legislation and regulations early childhood services are bound by and how those particular regulations link in with the Early Years Learning Framework. Once you look through that resource, you're going to use the information within it to complete that report. You're then going to save that to your desktop, and you can upload that report right here under question 4. Once you've done that, then you move on to question 5. This one here is asking you to look at 2 other approved learning frameworks and discuss the similarities and differences. It does say you can put this in a report or a table format. I really advise you to really have a look at this and really identify in detail the similarities and differences. It needs to be a very thoroughly answered question. Once you've completed, as always, just over to the corner and press the submit button, and that will go straight through to your trainer. Good luck.